Chapter 11 of Charles Dickens by G. K. Chesterton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dick Durrett. Chapter 11. On the alleged optimism of Dickens. In one of the plays of the decadent period, an intellectual expressed the atmosphere of his epoch by referring to Dickens as a vulgar optimist. I have in previous chapter suggested something of the real strangeness of such a term. After all, the main matter of astonishment, or rather of admiration, is that optimism should be vulgar. In a world in which physical distress is almost a common lot, we actually complain that happiness is too common. In a world in which the majority is physically miserable, we actually complain of the sameness of praise. We are bored with the abundance of approval. When we consider that the conditions of the vulgar really are, it is difficult to imagine a stranger or more splendid tribute to humanity than such a phrase as vulgar optimism. It is as if one spoke of vulgar martyrdom or common crucifixion. First, however, let it be said frankly that there is a foundation for the charge against Dickens which is implied in the phrase about vulgar optimism. It does not concern itself with Dickens's confidence in the value of existence and the intrinsic victory of virtue. That is not optimism but religion. It is not concerned with his habit of making bright occasions bright and happy stories happy. That is not optimism but literature. Nor is it concerned even with his peculiar genius for the description of an almost bloated joviality. That is not optimism, it is simply Dickens. With all these higher variations of optimism I deal elsewhere, but over and above all these there is a real sense in which Dickens laid himself open to the accusation of a vulgar optimism, and I desire to put the admission of this first before the discussion that follows. Dickens did have a disposition to make his characters at all costs happy, or, to speak more strictly, he had a disposition to make them comfortable rather than happy. He had a sort of literary hospitality. He too often treated his characters as if they were his guests. From a host is always expected, and always ought to be expected, as long as human civilization is healthy, a strictly physical benevolence, if you will, a kind of coarse benevolence. Food and fire and such things should always be the symbols of the man entertaining men, because they are things which all men beyond question have in common. But something more than this is needed from a man who is imagining and making men, the artist, the man who is not receiving men, but rather sending them forth. As I shall remark in a moment in the matter of the Dickens villains, it is not true that he made every one thus at home, but he did do it in a certain wide class of incongruous characters. He did it to all who had been in any way unfortunate. It had needed its origin, a very beautiful origin, in his realization of how much a little pleasure was to such people. He knew well that the greatest happiness that had been known since Eden is the happiness of the unhappy. So far he is admirable, and as long as he was describing the ecstasy of the poor, the borderland between pain and pleasure, he was at his highest, Nothing that has ever been written about the human delights, no earthly paradise, no utopia, has ever come so near the quick nerve of happiness as his descriptions of the rare extravagances of the poor, such as admirable description, for instance, as that of Kit Nubbles taking his family to the theatre. For he seizes on the real source of the whole pleasure, a holy fear. Kit tells the waiter to bring the beer, and the waiter, instead of saying, "Did you address that language to me?" said, "Pot of beer, sir." "Yes, sir." That internal and quivering humility of Kit is the only way to enjoy life or banquets, and the fear of the waiter is the beginning of dining. People in this mood take their pleasures sadly, which is the only way of taking them at all. So far Dickens is supremely right. As long as he was dealing with such penury and such festivity, his touch was almost invariably sure. But when he came to more difficult cases, to people who for one reason or another could not be cured with one good dinner, he did develop this other evil, this genuinely vulgar optimism of which I speak. And the mark of it is this, that he gave the characters a comfort that had no especial connection with themselves. He threw comfort at them like alms. There are cases at the end of his stories in which his kindness to his characters is a careless and insolent kindness. He loses his real charity and adopts the charity of the charity organization society, the charity that is not kind, the charity that is puffed up and that does behave itself unseemly. At the end of some of his stories he deals out his characters a kind of outdoor relief. I will give you two instances. The whole meaning of the character of Mr. Micawber is that a man can be always almost rich by constantly expecting riches. The lesson is a really important one in our sweeping modern sociology. We talk of the man whose life is a failure, but Micawber's life never is a failure because it is always a crisis. We think constantly of the man, if he looked back, would see that his existence was unsuccessful, but Micawber never does look back. He always looks forward, because the bailiff is coming tomorrow. You cannot say he is defeated, for his absurd battle never ends. He cannot despair of life, for he is so much occupied in living. All this is of immense importance in the understanding of the poor. It is worth all the alum novelists that ever insulted democracy. But how did it happen that the man who created this Micawber could pension his off at the end of the story and make him a successful colonial mayor? Micawber never did succeed, never ought to succeed. His kingdom is not of this world. But this is an excellent instance of Dickens's disposition to make his characters grossly and incongruously comfortable. There is another instance in the same book. Dora, the first wife of David Copperfield, is a very genuine and amusing figure. She has certainly far more force of character than Agnes. She represents the infinite and divine irrationality of the human heart. What possessed Dickens to make her such a dehumanized prig as to recommend her husband to marry another woman? One could easily respect a husband who after time and development made such a marriage.